are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. As we said in the intro, in this hour, we will be looking at the politics of West Virginia and how they are changing. And one participant in those politics is none other than the executive producer of the Zero Hour, our very own Troy Miller. So he moves from behind the camera to in front of it. First of all, Troy Miller, welcome in this new role. Welcome to the Zero Hour.
Oh, thanks for having me, Richard. It's always a pleasure to be on this side of the camera, although it's a little bit, something must have gone horribly wrong today that this is where we are.
Oh, I wouldn't say so. I would say horribly right. Is that so? As we get into exploring the politics of West Virginia, and we'll be talking later in the hour with a Democratic Party activist who has made a name for herself by wresting a lot of control in the Democratic Party away from the fossil fuel industry, which has held sway there for since time immemorial. And I see that you were part of a Twitter exchange about it. Someone pointed out on Twitter that the severe thunderstorm watch of the other day was the 25th this year alone for the area, by far a record for any year, which is a sign. And you responded, this is part of what climate change looks like for West Virginia. The governor keeps acknowledging the real harms of climate change, including increased flooding, endemic Lyme's disease, more frequent and powerful storms, along with heat records, but just can't or won't connect the dots. What do you mean?
Well, I think that, to take the one point that I think many people outside of West Virginia will miss is the comment about Lyme's disease in particular. When I was growing up in the 90s in the Wheeling area, Lyme's disease was not a thing that we really were concerned about. We knew it was happening in New England. We knew it was happening in the Northeast, but it wasn't, tick bites had their own other problems with it. It wasn't quite as prevalent as it is now. Climate scientists in the early 2000s were already pointing out that as the climate changes, Lyme's disease and ticks are going to be able to live over winter longer and have more vectors between deer, mice, and these types of things that live close to us in human populations. And we're going to have a spread of Lyme's disease out from like what I would consider the epicenter of Connecticut and Rhode Island. Now, the kicker on this is back in May, I want to say, our governor, Jim Justice, contracted Lyme's disease in the Wheeling area. And, or they think it was in the Wheeling area. It was after a campaign stop in the Wheeling area. And about a few days later, he tested positive for Lyme's disease. And it just seems beyond me that it's so on the nose what we're seeing here. And the governor's office issued a whole statement about how the governor has Lyme's disease and blah, blah, blah. I'll also say that Lyme's testing in this area, in the Eastern Panhandle where I live, has now, they're basically triaging people. If you don't have any initial signs and you just had a tick bite and you think it was on there for fewer than 36 hours, they're not even going to run a Lyme's test on you until you start showing symptoms or something like that. So I wonder how he got that special treatment that he was able to get or what symptoms he was showing. And he says everyone needs to take him very seriously and the ticks and yada, yada, yada. But the reality is this is a completely climate-related event, the fact that we have endemic Lyme's disease in West Virginia now, more or less across the state, and it's moving southwards. There's a little bit of intuition there because we think of climate change making everything warmer and everything moving northwards towards the equator, but because of where the Lyme's disease originated from and also how animals have moved southwards as winters have gotten shorter and everything, it has moved in sort of this opposite direction. But with that, there's one thing that we've known for decades about how climate change, human-driven climate change, and the models are showing it's going to impact West Virginia, is increased flooding and increased droughts, which seems paradoxical, but it's only with a very superficial understanding of ecosystems and wide environments, because there are going to be areas that get much hotter, much drier, and we're going to see more fires as a result. We've already seeing this out west, for instance. But because of the nature of the Appalachian Range and where it falls and stretches up and across the longitudinally from basically Nova Scotia all the way down to Mississippi is largely the Appalachian region. There's also going to be a lot of water that gets caught as the weather patterns move across, as the Arctic collapses and more warmer water comes down, and as the jet stream collapses, but also just from increased evaporation from our trees. We have it's a temperate rainforest for all intents and purposes here in West Virginia and Appalachia. We are one of the most biodiverse regions in the world, right up there with any of the most ecologically rich and biodiverse regions like the Amazon or Indonesian areas. Anywhere you can think of that people go to tourist and see all of the millions of bugs and wildlife, things like that. We have a biodiversity that rivals that right here in this country. As climate change happens, but people don't think about it. It's literally right here in our backyards. But people don't think about the fact that as climate change impacts this country, there's going to be a lot of migration of animals. And there are ecologists who refer to Appalachia in this region as a superhighway, basically for the preservation of biodiversity. I'm bringing this all back around. We have the potential in West Virginia in particular, the only state that is completely within the Appalachian Mountain Range and the Appalachian Regional Commission's demarcations, so both politically and geologically, we are a very kind of quintessentially Appalachian state. We are in a position where if we invest now, if we invest in mitigation and adaptation now, we could become one of the breadbaskets of America because of how the region is going to become more temperate and moister. If we do nothing now, as our governor seems to want to do, and to say simply, climate has always changed and there's nothing we can do about it, and it's just a coincidence that the models for human climate change have predicted what we're seeing here. Just yesterday or just today, we pre-taped this program, so either Thursday or Wednesday, the Governor Justice had to declare a state of emergency in McDowell County because of the flooding down there. Just across the border in Buchanan County, Virginia, there was entire houses floated away in flooding and storming 2 days ago. So I guess that must have been Tuesday if we're talking on Thursday. We are seeing the effects now, and it is really sickening to me that a coal billionaire governor can stand there and call for federal disaster funds every time this happens, can say, I have Lyme's disease, and not acknowledge that these were predictable outcomes of unaddressed, runaway, anthropogenic climate change. So,
doesn't overmining and overforesting also contribute to flooding?
Absolutely. The first major ecological changes that happened in this area, I would argue, were when many of the beavers were wiped out throughout Appalachia for the fur trade early on, and they were ecologically crafting the area around us. The wetlands that the first European settlers found throughout Appalachia were largely created by beaver dams and other types of animals that produce this thing. Now, the fur trade then, driven by European demand, wiped out large swaths of beavers in the area. The next stage then was in the 19th century with the lumber industry. And we still don't have, and then the blight that took out the American chestnut. All of these things have tremendously changed the Appalachian environment. And as you take down these big trees and the root systems, you absolutely create more subsidence, more flooding. With the coal industry in particular, with surface mining operations, you have wiped out in acres and acres and miles of root systems that were going to catch and pull rain down into the soils and then evaporate back up into the sky, is now running off what they would consider the closest minimum contour, or a relatively topographically similar relief of these mountains is basically what they have to repair them to with surface mining operations. And they're just, it's nothing but a big water slide at that point. The same token with underground mine operations. All of this increased flooding is going to fill these mines, and they are going to collapse. There and what the outflows of it are going to be completely toxic into our streams and waterways. There was one other point I was going to add on to that, but it's oh, the coal slurry dams. Much of our audience is, and I wasn't alive back then, but much of our audience can recall the 1972 Buffalo Creek disaster here in West Virginia that was highlighted by, I think, Kai Stevenson, I think is the author's name, in the book, Everything in Its Path, that then he updated. He wrote it as a sociological study back in 1973 or 4, right after the disaster happened. And he updated it in 2004 after Katrina because the parallels for response and the parallels for basically the setup for a man-made disaster are unmistakable, and the sociological impacts on these communities. There are many, 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 I don't know exactly how many off the top of my head, of these coal slurry impoundments that are not being, some of them are designed right over schools. Here's a cliff face that they've shoved an impoundment up against. Behind it all up here is all of the toxic slurry and everything from the operation. A little bit more rain. Again, we've designed a lot of these engineering things for 50-year storms that were happening, or 100-year storms that were happening 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Now our engineering standards do not reflect the intensity of the storms and the frequency of the storms that we're seeing, which is a direct, if there's one thing that the federal government can do and the Army Corps of Engineers can do, it's to update these standards. But this has become a highly political, what should be a scientific discussion has become a highly politicized discussion. Again, you don't have to ask a farmer or ask someone who lives down in the holler whether they can see the impacts of climate change. They see it and they live it. What many people have been convinced of is that this is, essentially God's will, right? This is the climate changes. It always has changed, and it's difficult for us as humans. We have an 80-year lifespan, and we can remember some of it, and over each generation. A great example of this is when you used to go on road trips, I'm sure as a kid, you stopped pretty regularly to wipe off the bugs off your windshield.
Right, exactly. I was thinking about that. Yeah.
Right.
And now people don't have to do that.
Exactly.
Right.
I can't remember the last time I had to do that. Maybe when you hit a couple of large bugs out in Montana or something like that, they're large enough splat that you still have to wash it off. But it's not because you're getting covered with it in the way that there's a Far Side comic that comes into mind every time I think about this type of thing. Same thing with the size of fish. Every generation, because we're catching all of the biggest fish out of these, choose it, the ocean or the lakes or streams or wherever, the next generation's biggest fish are not going to be as large as the ones before that. We're not letting restock happen. And we're kind of taking this easy come, easy go attitude towards it. And again, it seems that Jim Justice and other Republican governors and sold out Democrats, frankly, just the same, are perfectly fine using federal funding, using public funds to react to exactly what has been predicted. But they all of a sudden, if we're talking about spending for climate, our Senator Joe Manchin just said the other day that he's concerned about inflation here because of spending. Well, what about the spending that we're having to do retroactively that is more expensive now than if we had started addressing some of these issues 10 years ago, and will be more expensive 10 years from now unless we started addressing these issues now, right?
So what would, in the couple of minutes we have left, what would connecting the dots look like for a Governor Jim Justice or a Senator? You just mentioned what it might look like for a Senator Manchin, which would be spending the kind of money we need to spend now to invest, to avoid spending much more and avoiding a lot of misery in the future. But let's say the governor of West Virginia, what would connecting the dots mean in terms of different policies?
So right now, for instance, rather than requesting emergency relief funds or, there's the simple act of saying, hey, we would like some of this climate funds, and maybe earmarking all of this for the states is a good thing for us. There's that simple level of it. But right now in West Virginia, we're trying to spend down the surplus from the American Recovery Plan. And I think it was something like over 1.1 billion. Again, so a lot of this it's not really a surplus. It's more of budgetary tricks of underestimating things. So then you can say you have a surplus. But as a result, he's looking to give a 10% flat tax cut, basically personal income tax cut to every West Virginian. You and I know that you can't do that without it being a regressive tax cut. But you know what else we could do with that? We could deal with some of our culverts that we know are flooding more often and are causing washways and things like this. We could proactively address some of our bridges and proactively deal with some of our dams, or maybe go back and because we know that so much of the engineering that we did in the 20th century actually caused more ecological harm than it did benefits, and dams are a great example of this, we could go back and revisit some of these things. West Virginia is a relatively large state, and every hill and holler is different from the next. So it's not, there's no one size fits all here, but there are significant investments that can be made. And at the very least, he could stop denying human driven climate change, and we could start investing into communities right now. I would argue that one of the things we could do is not decrease the severance taxes on fossil fuels, as the Republicans in this state continually push for. And again, some bad Democrats, but rather increase the severance taxes so that we can get more money out of it per ton of, or per whatever unit we're using between gas and coal. And we could then use that to reinforce our communities and create adaptation, if not mitigation, right? As a state, there's only so much we can do in terms of climate mitigation. With us, it's unfortunately, like something like 17% of our economy still is dependent on the coal industry. So we have to fill in the gaps there too and move forward. We can't just be telling miners that we're going to put you back to work doing coding. We need to rebuild manufacturing and do it in a way that is sustainable, not just for ecologically sustainable, but actually an economy that can be locally based and resilient, right? Distributed, locally based, resilient economies are very much what we need. And right now we have very centralized industries. The coal industry is a hyper-centralized industry with only a few large actors compared to other industries. And they are profiting off of despoiling our land, causing many of the harms that we're seeing from coal that was mined and burned 100 years ago, and are locking in, unfortunately, not just the fate of West Virginia, but the entire planetary fate here. This is a concern.
Absolutely, and that sounds like a great plan to me. And I will have to continue this discussion again sometime. I'd ask you more about it now.
And I'll have to put us in touch with people who are much smarter than I and who have done the work already on this research-wise here in West Virginia.
And I don't want my producer to yell at me if I run over time. So. Troy Miller, West Virginia organizer and producer of the 0 Hour, fascinating stuff. And thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Richard. It's always a pleasure. And, you and I will talk right after this segment.
I'm sure we will. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to the 0 Hour.